Episode 1, Introduction to Narcissism under 10 minutes. Part 1, What Narcissism is and how you can identify it. This is a brief summary from the first podcast. Hi, I am Frank. Welcome to the beginning of this series, and today, April 23rd, 2026. I'm doing the brief summary of Episode 1, Part 1, What Narcissism is. I have been often asked questions about this topic, so I decided to finally respond in a public forum to the questions I am asked in person via email or text. Let me begin by saying that I like to keep things simple, clear, and easy to follow, avoiding confusion and misunderstandings. With that said, let's talk about what narcissism is, what it can look like in everyday life, and why it matters. And by the way, this is not about diagnosing people from a distance or without the proper clinical knowledge. This is about learning how to recognize harmful patterns before they begin to cause you emotional or physical harm. Let's begin. But first, a warm shout out to Tiffany from Princeton, New Jersey. Thank you for your questions. Tiffany says, Frank, what is narcissism in plain language? In simple terms, narcissism is a pattern characterized by multiple signs where a person becomes excessively focused on themselves, their image, and their significance. They tend to be very self-absorbed and require constant attention and admiration. In addition to, they have the need to be pampered often. They believe they deserve special treatment. They constantly feel like their needs matter more than everyone else's. Now, I want to emphasize a very important point that makes a big difference. Not every proud person is a narcissist. Not every confident person is a narcissist. Not every sarcastic person is a narcissist. Not every difficult person is a narcissist. Not every selfish person is a narcissist. Those are some of the traits people most often confuse with narcissism, but by themselves, each one do not define it. Now, what makes this serious is not one bad day or being rude at a frustrating moment. It is the consistent pattern. I earlier mentioned the key word, consistent pattern. However, they are more dangerous toxic patterns, such as someone repeatedly seeking attention, avoids responsibility, shows no empathy, constantly tries to control others, and overall lacks compassion. You are with the most toxic and dangerous narcissistic individual. Here's a simple way to remember and connect the most toxic characteristics of a serious narcissist. I use the words clear and space. Here is why. The clear warning. Because it makes it clear to spot and simplify the warning signs. It allows you to see the person for who they really are. C for control. L for lack of empathy. E for evading responsibility. A for attention seeking. And R for ruthless reflecting their lack of compassion. Consequently, you must give yourself the space method. Because the best thing to do with a severe toxic person is to give yourself space and to make it easy to see why you need space. Let's connect the letters once again. S for the seek too much attention. P for they look for power to control you. A for they avoid to take responsibility. C not for cool, but for callousness, in other words, no compassion. And finally, E for empathy, lacking. These 5 specific behaviors, which I have mentioned twice, are the most concerning. You should stay alert for them, and with careful observation, they are simple to identify. All right, let's see what the next question. This next question comes again from Tiffany in Princeton, NJ. Thank you for your questions, Tiffany says. So, is narcissism some sort of self-obsessive love? Nope, not exactly. A lot of people hear that and think narcissism simply means loving yourself too much. But healthy self-respect, self-love, and self-worth is not the same thing. Healthy self-regard says, I value myself and I value others as well. Narcissistic behavior often says, I matter more. My needs are first. My image is everything I must protect. That is a major difference. A healthy person can feel good about themselves and still respect your boundaries, your feelings, and your dignity. A narcissistic person may want a lot of admiration and attention, but give very little of it in return. All right, with that established, let's see what's next. A big thank you to Tony from Brooklyn, New York for his question. Tony says, Frank, how does narcissism usually show up? It doesn't show up right away, and it is a bit complicated to describe because it can show up in many ways. Let's go through the most common. They always want to be the center of attention. They are always fishing for praise or recognition. They become angry when ignored, quite often react badly to criticism. They blame others instead of taking responsibility. When is there wrongdoing? They act entitled. They lack empathy, always trying to control conversations, situations, people, and outcomes. Yes, they are typically charming when it helps them, but cold when it does not. Many people with narcissistic traits want to be seen as special, impressive, or above others. And when that image is threatened, their behavior turns defensive, cruel, and more controlling. Example 1. Let's say someone at work finishes a project with a team. Instead of thanking the team, that person acts as if they did everything alone. Then when someone else gets credit too, they become bitter and offended. That may be more than confidence. That may be a sign of narcissistic thinking. Example 2. Or imagine a person in a relationship who always wants compliments, attention, and emotional support. But when is their partner hurting, they dismiss it all and say, "You're too emotional." That is the most common pattern. They want care, but they always struggle to give it. All right, another good question by Tiffany from Princeton and Jay Frank. Why do narcissistic people need so much attention? Okay, let me say that. Quite often, underneath that tough surface, there are deep insecurities. Even though they may act superior, they need constant outside praise to hold themselves together. They depend on admiration the way other people depend on reassurance. So that's the reason why they need to be praised, because it makes them feel good about themselves. When they are ignored, corrected, or challenged, they feel threatened. So, narcissistic people are fine as long as life goes their way. But when they do not get what they want, you begin to see the big problem. This question is from Kelly, East Brunswick, NJ. Frank, do you know, why do narcissists take criticism so badly? Let me say that it is because criticism can feel like an attack on the image they work so hard to hide and protect. A healthy person may not enjoy criticism, but they can still reflect on it. A narcissistic person may hear even the gentlest feedback or observation as disrespect, rejection, or humiliation. So instead of listening, they may result in arguing, attacking you, passing the blame, and even punishing you for calling them out, turning the issue back on you. That is why trying to voice out your concerns about them can become so frustrating. So, attempting to solve just one simple problem, and suddenly you're the problem. In reference, let's see example 3. A partner that genuinely cares says, "That comment hurt me, but I understand. I'm sorry." Instead, a narcissistic partner says, "You always ruin everything. Why are you so extremely sensitive?" Let me ask, how is that accountability? It is not. Instead, that's deflection. All right, this example is work-related. Narcissistic boss. A supervisor receives feedback from staff and responds, "You should be grateful you even have this job." At this point, the issue you were having is no longer the only problem. It is now their retaliation. So the new issue becomes fear and control. Okay, one last point and clarification before I close. Yes, it is true. Narcissistic people can be very charming. Some are polished, funny, generous in the public eye, and socially impressive. That is exactly why it can be a bit hard to spot at first. Still, charm is not proof of character. Confidence is not proof of empathy. And being impressive in public does not mean someone is safe in private. That is why we all need to pay close attention to patterns. How do they treat people who disagree with them? How do they act when they are not getting attention? How do they respond when they are told no? Do they show empathy when someone else is hurting? Do they take responsibility, or do they always blame someone else? Those basic questions will tell you much more than their smile, charm, and public image. So there, it's in a nutshell the main idea of part 1. Once again, just keep in mind that narcissism is not just vanity. It is often a pattern of entitlement, attention-seeking, poor empathy, defensiveness, and control. The real issue is not just the label, it is the repeated harm it can cause to anyone in any kind of relationships. With that said, in the next episode, part 2, I will talk about how narcissistic exposure changes your brain, how narcissistic parents and bosses can affect your state of mind. We'll talk about how narcissistic behavior can become emotionally exhausting and deeply harmful. All right, it is time to close this brief segment summary by thanking all of you for your time and attention. Stay safe, stay aware, and I'll see you in the next episode.